There is a specific kind of quiet that changes everything. Not the quiet of someone who has given up. Not the silence of someone who has swallowed their words once again, retreated into themselves, and decided to endure. This is a different quiet entirely. You probably know the moment I'm describing, not because you can fully name it, but because you have felt it begin inside you like a slow change in the tide. You stopped waiting for them to understand. You stopped rehearsing the conversation where they would finally see what they had been doing. Something shifted beneath your words, beneath your expressions, beneath the version of you that they were still watching for, and in that shift, without a single announcement, you began to leave. What you may not have expected is what happened next. Because the moment real detachment begins, not the performance of it, not the angry withdrawal or the temporary distance meant to provoke a reaction, but the real thing, the quiet internal kind that has no audience and makes no demands, the people around you who had been feeding on your presence began to sense it before you had done a single visible thing. That is what this is about. Not tactics. Not the list of things to say or not say. Not a strategy for leaving someone difficult. This is about something much more precise and much more profound. What toxic people notice first when your detachment becomes real, and why that noticing reveals the exact nature of the hold they had on you all along. Because here is what almost no one talks about. The most controlled moment in that entire dynamic is not when they escalate. It is not when they manipulate. It is not even when they hurt you. The most controlled moment, the moment where the whole architecture of their influence over you lives or dies, is the exact second they sense that you no longer need their approval to feel okay. That second is what we are here to examine. And what comes next is the part most people are never quite ready to hear. Before anything else, something needs to be said clearly and without qualification. The fact that you were pulled into a toxic dynamic does not mean something is broken in you. It does not mean you were naive. It does not mean you failed some test that more perceptive people would have passed. It means you were human in the presence of someone who had learned, long before they met you, how to make themselves indispensable through pain. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Because the moment you understand that you weren't weak, that you were, in fact, deeply conditioned by forces much older than this relationship, the fog begins to lift. And what you can see in that clarity is worth everything. Carl Jung spent decades mapping the architecture of the human psyche, and one of his most essential observations was this: we do not connect with each other only through our conscious intentions. We connect, often far more powerfully, through our unhealed places. Through the parts of ourselves we have never fully seen, never fully accepted, never been permitted to express. Jung called this the shadow, not a metaphor for evil, but the accumulation of everything we learned to suppress in order to survive our earliest environments. Toxic people, without any conscious strategy, become extraordinarily skilled at finding those places in others. Not because they are deliberate architects of harm, but because their own shadow is so active, so unprocessed, so alive with unmet need, that it reaches outward like a hand in the dark searching for something familiar to grip. And when it finds the corresponding wound in you, the old belief that love must be earned, that your needs are too much, that peace comes from making others comfortable at the expense of yourself, the connection that forms feels, for a while, almost like being seen. Jung described this as projection. The qualities they cannot face in themselves, the neediness, the rage, the terror of being fundamentally insufficient, get transferred onto you. You begin to feel their feelings as if they were yours. Their emotional state becomes your responsibility. Their instability becomes your emergency to manage. The boundary between where you end and where they begin dissolves so gradually that by the time you notice, you cannot remember when it happened. And this is where Jung's work becomes uncomfortable, in the best possible way. Because what he observed is that when you begin to reclaim that space, when you slowly, quietly start pulling those projections back, not as a decision but as a natural consequence of turning toward yourself, their psyche registers the withdrawal immediately. Not as a thought, as a feeling, a shift in pressure, an absence where something familiar used to be. They feel your detachment before they understand it. And that feeling will tell you something essential about everything that came before. The question that sits at the center of all of this, the one that goes deeper than the relationship you are trying to leave, is this: why did their approval matter so much to you in the first place? not as a judgment, as a genuine and important inquiry. Because the real answer to that question does not begin with them. It begins somewhere much earlier. It begins in the first environments where you learned what love was and what it required. Jung observed a pattern so consistent across the people he worked with, so present in the myths and dreams and stories of cultures separated by centuries, that he came to see it as a fundamental feature of the human condition. When a child grows up in an environment where love is conditional, where warmth is given as a reward and withdrawn as a punishment, that child learns something devastating. They learn that who they naturally are is not quite enough. That the self they were born with must be modified, adjusted, and carefully performed in order to receive care. And so they build what Jung called the persona. A mask constructed not out of deception, but out of survival. A version of the self designed to navigate a world that did not feel safe enough for their authentic face. The persona was not a mistake. It protected you when you were small and had no other tools. But it came at a cost, because behind it, fed by everything you suppressed in order to be acceptable, the shadow grew. All the needs you were taught to be ashamed of. All the anger you swallowed because expressing it felt too dangerous. All the grief you were never permitted to have. All the desires and fears and hungers you learned to hide because someone important once responded to them with silence, with contempt, or with disapproval. You have been exhausted not by what you do, but by who you pretend to be while doing it. This is the specific wound that toxic people found in you. Not a flaw in your character. Not a failure of perception. A wound inherited from long before they arrived. The deep belief that your presence is conditional, that your worth must be continuously earned, that leaving means abandoning, and that someone else's emotional instability is somehow your emergency to resolve. The suffering you feel in trying to detach is not proof that you love them too much. It is proof that leaving them requires you to simultaneously confront the original conditioning, the one that made their brand of attention feel, at some level, like something you recognized. That is why this particular kind of ending is unlike other endings. It is not just the close of a relationship. It is the beginning of a confrontation with yourself that you have been quietly deferring since childhood. And here is the question I want you to sit with, not answer immediately, but feel the full weight of. What if the hold they had on you was never really about them at all? Keep watching. Because what we're about to uncover changes everything. When most people decide to detach from someone toxic, they do something entirely understandable. They try to leave well. They write the message that explains everything with precision and care. They have the final conversation, the one where the other person will finally understand what happened, will see the harm they caused, and will respond with something, anything, that allows the ending to feel clean. They look for closure. They want to be understood before they go. You already know how that goes. It doesn't work. Not because you didn't explain well enough. Not because you lacked the right words or the right timing or the right tone. It doesn't work because what you are actually seeking in that moment is permission to leave from the exact person whose hold you are trying to escape. And this is the paradox that breaks people inside these cycles. The more you seek closure from someone who cannot provide it, the more authority over your own freedom you return to them. Toxic people do not become psychologically unsafe because they are consciously villainous. They become unsafe because their entire interior architecture has been built around maintaining emotional attachment, specifically, around keeping others in a state of dependency. They are, in many ways, experts at sensing the moment that dependency is withdrawing. And when you come to them with explanations, with requests to be understood, with a need for a graceful goodbye, their psyche does not read that as departure. It reads it as negotiation. It reads it as an open door. The escalation you encounter when you try to leave thoughtfully, the sudden tenderness, the volcanic rage, the revision of shared history, the victimhood that makes you the one who has caused harm, is not calculated cruelty. It is panic. It is the frantic response of a psyche that has never developed the capacity to self-regulate, now confronting the loss of the person who has been doing that regulating on its behalf. Which has been you. Real detachment does not seek understanding from the person being detached from. Real detachment has already accepted, fully, quietly, and without drama, that the understanding it once needed will not come. And it has decided, somewhere beneath words, that it no longer requires it. This is not coldness. It is not cruelty in reverse. It is something far more powerful: clarity. The distinction between coldness and clarity is one of the most important things you will ever learn to feel in your own body. Coldness still needs a reaction. Clarity needs nothing. The people who leave these dynamics successfully, not just physically, but psychologically, are not the ones who finally said the right thing. They are the ones who stopped needing to say anything at all. What comes next is a story. And in that story lives the paradox at the center of everything this video has been building toward. There was a woman, I will call her Maya, who spent nearly 4 years inside a friendship that had slowly, imperceptibly consumed her. It didn't begin that way. These things rarely do. In the beginning there was warmth, a feeling of rare intensity, of being seen in a way that felt almost impossible, as if someone had finally located the version of herself she had spent years carefully hiding from everyone else. But warmth, in that friendship, turned conditional over time. The sense of being seen became the experience of being watched. Every boundary Maya tried to hold, a cancelled plan, an hour of unavailability, a moment where she simply didn't offer enough enthusiasm, was met with a shift in the atmosphere. The silence that followed wasn't neutral. It was a message. It was designed to be felt. Maya tried everything reasonable people try. She explained herself. She apologized for things she hadn't done. She began editing her words in advance, smoothing her behavior before conversations even began, trying to prevent conflicts that hadn't happened yet. She became so preoccupied with managing the other person's emotional weather that she lost track of the fact that she hadn't talked about her own life in months. When she finally decided to create distance, she approached it the way she approached everything in that relationship: carefully. She wrote a thoughtful message. She offered space with warmth. She tried to make the ending kind. The response was immediate. Accusations. A rewriting of their shared history that cast Maya as the source of every difficulty. A version of events that made her doubt her own memory. And Maya, trained over years to absorb responsibility for this person's emotional state, started to wonder if she was, in fact, the problem. Then something shifted. Not loudly. Not with a revelation or a dramatic moment of clarity. She simply stopped responding. Not in anger. Not as a calculated tactic. She stopped because she finally understood, in her body rather than her mind, that every response, no matter how gentle, no matter how measured, was a door she was holding open. The silence that followed was the hardest she had ever maintained. But inside that silence, something began returning to her. A stillness she had almost forgotten. A sense of her own edges, where she ended and someone else began. Jung wrote that the most frightening journey is not the descent into darkness. It is the return to yourself. Because on the way back, you discover how long you have been absent. And here is the paradox that Maya found on that return, the one that sits at the center of everything. The people with the most power over you are not the ones who hurt you most. They are the ones who made you feel, even for a moment, that you needed their permission to exist. Let that settle. Because once it does, truly does, the entire architecture of the dynamic begins to lose its hold. Not through force. Not through strategy. Through understanding so complete that there is simply nothing left to argue with. On the other side of real detachment, something unexpected happens. It is not the dramatic relief you may have imagined. Not the sudden exhale, the flood of lightness, the feeling of chains falling away at once. It arrives more quietly than that. More slowly. The way dawn arrives, without announcement, without asking permission, simply there when you look up. You start to notice your own thoughts again. Not the anxious, looping monitoring of someone else's moods. Not the constant preemptive calibration of your own words before you speak them. Your thoughts. The ones that are actually yours. The ones that have been patient, steady, and waiting underneath all that noise. This is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming, at last and in full, yourself. Not the self that was shaped by fear. Not the persona constructed for survival. The self that existed before all of it, underneath every adaptation, beneath every mask, beneath every carefully curated version of you that you offered to people who were never truly going to see it. Individuation is not a destination you reach. It is a direction you move in. A process that begins the moment you stop organizing your interior life around someone else's instability. In practice, it looks like this. You stop rehearsing conversations. You stop bracing for their moods as if they are weather systems you must prepare your whole body for. You stop translating your own needs into a softer language you think might be acceptable to them. You begin, slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks you do not judge yourself for, to let yourself be a complete person again. Something in you knows this. It has always known. You just needed someone to say it out loud. The toxic person, in this new landscape, begins to lose their power of definition over you. Not because you've assigned them to the role of villain, that would still be giving them too much of your attention, but because your focus has genuinely, finally, turned inward. And a person whose entire psychological economy has depended on your emotional engagement, now starved of it, becomes precisely what they were before you arrived. Someone navigating their own unintegrated wounds with tools that were never sufficient for the work. That is not your crisis to manage. It never was. What is yours, the only thing that ever truly was, is the work of returning to yourself. The integration of the parts that were suppressed in the service of a relationship that was costing you your interior life. The gradual, sometimes painful, but ultimately extraordinary process of meeting yourself without apology. The fact that you are here, listening to this, choosing depth over distraction, that is not passive. That is the work beginning. That is the conversation your own psyche has been trying to initiate with you for longer than you know. You are not at the start of healing. You are further along than you have allowed yourself to believe. And there is one more thing left to say. The most important thing. The thing I have been building toward since the first word. You made it here. Not everyone does. Most people encounter something like this and find a reason to look away. Too close, too uncomfortable, too much like holding a mirror at an angle that shows what has been carefully avoided. But you stayed. You chose depth when it would have been easier to stop. And that choice, quiet and private as it was, means something. I want you to hear this directly. The fact that you are still watching is not an accident of the algorithm. It is not idle curiosity. Something in you made a choice to be here, to sit with these ideas, to let them find the places that needed to hear them. That is a decision the surface self does not make. That is a soul decision. Jung believed, with everything his life and work had taught him, that the human psyche moves toward wholeness the way a living thing moves toward light. Not because it is instructed to. Not because it has been convinced. But because wholeness is its nature. The toxic dynamic you are moving away from was never your nature. It was a detour. A long, exhausting, entirely human detour, taken by someone doing the best they could with a map available to them at the time. But you have a different map now. Real detachment, the kind that actually heals, is not the absence of feeling. It is not the performance of not caring. It is the presence of yourself. The quiet, unshakable knowledge that your peace is not a thing that can be earned or revoked by another person's mood. That your worth does not require their witness. That you are permitted to exist fully, not as a managed version of yourself, not as a translation of yourself into something easier for others to tolerate, but fully, without permission, without explanation, without apology. That is not arrogance. That is what health actually looks like. If something in this video moved you, if a single sentence found its way into a place you've been quietly carrying, I want to invite you to do one thing. Write in the comments, I choose myself. Not for me. For you. As the beginning of something. As the first quiet declaration of a person who is done waiting for permission. And if this channel speaks to the part of you that hungers for depth, the part that doesn't want comfort, but transformation, then subscribe. Not as a favor. As a choice. Because this is a space built for people who are serious about becoming who they actually are. We'll meet again in the next shadow that truth reveals.